Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English, AP English, and our objective now for the hour is it's a prodigious topic. Our goal is to introduce you to the great writer James Joyce. Let me say it this way. I, as you know, like statistics that matter, and this is one that can matter for you. At the very end of the 20th century, in 1999, Random House put together a list of the greatest novels of the 20th century. I recommend this to you because I recommend you Google it. It's there, easy to find. All you got to do is write down Random House 100 Greatest Novels of the 20th Century, and it'll immediately take you to this list. Of the 100 greatest novels ever written in the 20th century, number 1 was considered the greatest novel, number 2 the second greatest, and you can see the list, right? What's fascinating is two things about this list. Obviously, this list created a huge debate because there were a lot of writers that didn't even get mentioned on the list one time. Even writers who had written quite a few novels in the 20th century didn't even get on the list one time. So obviously, who was left off the list? Huge debate, as is always the case. What was more fascinating were the top 5. The top 5 novels of the 20th century were listed by Random House as the following. Number 1, James Joyce's Ulysses. Number 5, James Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Dude, are you ready for this? He gets 2 novels in the top 5 of the 100 greatest novels of the 20th century. There are cats who don't even make it to this list who are already considered classical writers. This guy gets 2 in the top 5. That alone would give us some reason to pause and say, well, we're probably in the company of greatness when we're looking at a James Joyce. And the answer, of course, would be, yeah, you're right. But how to get to James Joyce? Well, the way I like to get to James Joyce is actually through another poet named Baudelaire. And that's why you have your little handout in front of you. And I want to look at Baudelaire's poems. Unfortunately, I don't get a full hour with this, and this is really unfortunate. Baudelaire was very influential on the lives of both T.S. Eliot and James Joyce. You will see that famous line from The Wasteland at the end of To the Reader. Let's talk about not-so-happy poetry, shall we? Baudelaire looks at the world. He calls his collection of poetry The Black Flowers. So there you go, the flowers of evil, or the flowers of darkness, or the black flowers, however you wish to translate it. Here is his opening poem that he writes to you, the reader of his collection of poetry. Are you ready for this? By the way, this is not PG-rated poetry, which is why it's not in your high school anthology. But I think you are in a college class. We can bring in anything we wish, and Baudelaire probably deserves at least 20 or 30 seconds of read time. To the reader. Ignorance, error, cupidity, and sin possess our souls and exercise our flesh. Habitually, we cultivate remorse as beggars entertain and nurse their lice. Our sins are stubborn. Cowards, when contrite, we overpay confession with our pains. And when we're back again in human mire, vile tears we think will wash away our stains. Thrice potent Satan in our cursed bed lulls us to sleep, our spirit overkissed until the precious meal of our will is vaporized, that cunning alchemist. Who but the devil pulls our waking strings? Abominations lure us to their side. Each day we take another step to hell, descending through the stench, unhorrified. Like an exhausted rake, a prostitute, who mouths and chews the martyrized breast of an old withered whore. We steal in passing whatever joys we can, squeezing the driest orange all the more. Packed in our brains, incestuous as worms, our demons celibate in drunken gangs, and when we breathe, that hollow rasp is death, sliding invisibly down into our lungs. If the dull canvas of our wretched life is unembellished with such pretty ware as knives or poison, pyromania, rape, it is because our soul's too weak to dare. But in this den of jackals, monkeys, curs, scorpions, buzzards, snakes, this paradise of filthy beasts that screech, howl, grovel, grunt, in this menagerie of mankind's vice, there's one supremely hideous and impure, soft-spoken, not the type to cause a scene. He'd willingly make rubble of the earth and swallow up creation in a yawn. I mean ennui, the French word for boredom. Who in his hookah dreams produces hangmen and real tears together. How well you know this fastidious monster, reader, hypocrite, reader. You, my double, my brother. Now that final line, you hypocrite lecteur, mon semble, mon frère, is the line quoted in French by T.S. Eliot in Wasteland. In other words, don't roll your eyes at me, Baudelaire says to the reader, and somehow say, oh, right, it's so tragic, all those poor, lonely, lost people. Yeah, we're all in the same boat. You can understand how we are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, is born in a poem such as this. But that's just an introduction to Baudelaire for you. And about that, unfortunately, I can't say much more. I wish I could, but I can't. I'm going to move on to the Albatross, which becomes for Baudelaire one of the great poems about the role of the poet or the artist in a society that no longer cares about art or poetry. Remember the way Yeats said it is, caught in that central music, all neglect monuments of an aging intellect. This is how Baudelaire says it. Some will argue it's a better word picture. And since you are familiar with Coleridge's rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, about an old chap that does what? He kills a bird. What kind of bird? An albatross. Because you're familiar with that poem, this poem, well, now makes some sense. Let's read it together. The Albatross. Oft times, for diversion, seafaring men capture albatross, those vast birds of the seas that accompany at languorous pace boats plying their way through bitter straits. Having scarce been taken aboard, these kings of the blue, awkward and shy, piteously their great white wings let droop like oars at their sides. This winged voyager, how clumsy he is and weak. He just now so lovely, how comic and ugly. One with a stubby pipe teases his beak, another mimics, limping, the cripple who could fly. The poet resembles this prince of the clouds, who laughs at hunters and haunts the storms. Exiled to the ground amid the jeering pack, his giant wings will not let him walk. Let's go to Joyce. James Joyce will ask a really intriguing question. He asks a lot of questions, but the question that for us today is most interesting, at least it certainly is interesting to me, is this question. What about artists? Are artists somehow different from the rest of us? Are artists special in some really important way? Are artists born or are they made? Are artists born to be artists? In other words, is there something fundamentally different about them and they don't choose it? Or, rather, are artists these individuals that somewhere early in their youth make up their mind they're going to be painters or writers or whatever, sculptors, whatever, and then they kind of make themselves that, right? Is there a difference between writing a poem and being a poet? See, I'm coming at this question from different perspectives. Is there a difference between painting a picture and being a painter? Is there a difference between singing a song and being a diva? And are divas born or are they made? Are the most powerful operatic voices, for example, products of sustained training, practice, instruction? Or are they rather born with this quote-unquote gift? And we want to put the word gift in our notes, but we want to put it with rabbit ears around it, okay? Because anytime we start playing the game of the notion of talent, we immediately are met with the question of whether it's a gift or whether it's a curse. Let's go ahead and say it out loud. Joyce believes poets, artists are born. You do not make them. And they are, by then definition, something fundamentally otherworld. Now, as I end my year with you, I find myself, this is by conscious design, returning to my year with you at the very beginning. And some of you will maybe recall that I made the observation that the Greeks had a certain view of art that posited the gods as possessing a certain very special place in the cosmos. They were two things that were most important. They never died. They were immortal. And secondly, epistemologically, what they know is limitless. They know things that humans do not. Of course, humans are the antithetical to that. Humans, of course, mortal. We live, we die, right? Fish, flesh, or fowl come in all summer long, whatever is begotten, born, and dies. That's the essence of being human. And epistemologically, what we can know is virtually nothing. What's it going to be like the first time you step on that campus for college? So you don't know the answer to that. You can play the same game you played in 8th grade when you thought you knew what it was going to be like to come here to this whole experience. See, it's the same thing, recapitulated all over again. When you start literally writing down what you actually know, humans are met with a gross, small thimble of knowledge. Something you can claim absolute certainty about. Complete opposite of the gods. Well, for the Greeks, this is an uncomfortable position to be in. So what do? Well, they invent the concept of what they call the poet, what we would call the artist, right? I mean, it's our term, right? Artist. The idea is simple. These people are somehow specially born. They are not normal people in any sense of the word for the Greeks. Why? Because the gods translate to them important information. So whoever provides the Iliad to the Greek people, and we call him Homer for lack of a better name, but whoever provides that information, that's a very special cat. That guy didn't just invent all that stuff in his head. He called upon the muses, remember? And those muses then inspired. That word is an important word, inspiration. In other words, it comes from something outside of the poet. The poet is like a vessel. And the gods present this information, and then the poet turns around and provides that information to humans so that, after we, for example, hear, remember it's an auditory poem for a lot of years before you can read it, when you hear the story of the Iliad spoken by a bard or a poet, you are somehow, as a human then, given a little bit more information that allows you to be able to live your life, epistemologically speaking, with a little bit greater knowledge. Once you have epistis knowledge, then you can have some sense of ontology, how you're going to live your life. If you don't, well, you're basically like a cow in a field, the Greeks will say, if you don't have some sense of this divine inspired information. Got me? So for the Greeks, this is kind of their view. Joyce will play a similar game. And he will say, artists are different. They see the world totally different. So for example, the opening lines of Portrait of the Artist is an attempt by the artist, James Joyce, to capture what does it mean to be an artist. Are you ready for this? You're an artist when you're lying in your crib in the very early moments of your life. But for Joyce, how to express this idea? He opens with one of the famous openings of any novel. Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road. And this moo cow that was coming down along the road met a nice little boy named Baby Tucko. His father told him that story. His father looked at him through a glass. He had a hairy face. He was a baby Tucko. The moo cow came down the road where Betty Brine lived. She sold him and plate. Oh, the wild rose blossoms on the little green place. He sang that song. That was his song. And on it goes. And when you read this book, for those of you who at least tried to read the opening lines and decided that you would try, as opposed to Cliff's or whatever, to read this, the story itself can be easily summarized well enough to take an AR test and get a perfect score. But the reading of the actual novel is something far, far different. Dude, what are we reading when we pick up the opening lines of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man? What does a poet see? What does an artist see in the early years? Well, if you pick up the book, see, and I know some of you will do this later, you will discover in the first 5 pages, all 5 of the senses are elicited. Notice here what you can see, what you can hear, for example. For most of us, people singing to us is people singing to us. But for an artist, Whole different project. Those kids from the time they're very young see the world totally differently. Totally differently. They see it through different eyes, through different ears, through different sensations and touch. Now, of course, it's important to point out they have no clue what's going on. These poor new artists, no idea at all. Which is why when they arrive at school, they've been living in their mind and in their body all their life. So when they arrive at school for the first time that they associate with large numbers of people, they immediately are shocked by the fact they are fundamentally different than all the other kids. Right? So for example, what would happen if a kid actually cared about poetry? I don't mean the way you guys talk about, yeah, it's kind of a cool poem. I mean, if you couldn't read a poem, you would die. I mean that care about poetry. If you couldn't write a poem, you would die. I mean that kind of poem. I mean, poetry becomes so much a part of your life from the time you're very, very young that you carry books of poetry with you everywhere. And what would happen on a school playground if some bully kids recognized, you don't play soccer, you care about poetry. Let's have a little fun with him. And so they push him up against a fence and try and make him admit that the greatest poet of the English language is Tennyson, not Byron. You got to admit it. Tennyson is the greatest poet. Admit it. I will not. No, no, you will admit it or we're going to beat the ever-living snot out of you. I will not. The greatest poet of the English language for this young kid is Byron. He's ready. Are you ready for this? And see, for some of you are sitting there going, yeah, this really is a mark of insanity. See, because we just don't get it. We're back to our albatross, the bird that falls out of the sky. We can make fun of a person like this because those stupid sailors have no idea what an albatross really is. They can't get it. The kid is ready to get completely pummeled to death over the debate about whether Lord Byron is a better poet than Tennyson. We should point out its portrait of the artist as a young man. Let's talk about adolescence for a little bit. I've given you another handout. Take a look at that one. It's always difficult to know where to start on this topic. And when one does begin on this topic of adolescence, first of all, we should point out it's a fairly new idea. Now, you have been raised by people who were told there is this thing called stages of life. Okay? First, you're born, and then you get to be about age 2, and you acquire language. And then you get to be about age 5, and you start down this process of your education. But then you hit a very strange period at roughly age 10 to 12. Where you begin to fundamentally change physiologically, psychologically. Your brain goes through all these strange kind of changes. Hormonally, you change. And for about 10 years, 10 to 12, 20 to 22, what are you going to call this stage in development? Well, about 100 years ago, a psychologist, Kat, decided to call it adolescence. I should point this out. Nobody thought about adolescence 200 years ago on this planet, which is why they had to invent child labor laws to make sure 5-year-olds could not work more than 16 hours a day. Why? Because 5-year-olds worked 16 hours a day. Yeah. When you were 5, you were ready to go to work. Why? Well, I mean, come on, you could speak well enough to understand what people were telling you to do. You can be given a simple job, whatever that is, a repetitive job, and you're going to do it again and again and again. If you don't want to do it, well, read Dickens and he'll tell you about how those poor kids just get the ever-living snot beat out of them because they don't want to carry the coal to the fire and dump it and then come back and get some more. And that's what they do. So they have child labor laws invented to keep it from not going over 16 hours. You can only work them 16 hours. Of course, these laws were never actually enforced. Most children would work sometimes up to 17, 18 hours a day. And of course, then they would die, unless they somehow escaped that kind of work. It's only recently that psychologists begin to play a game with this notion of adolescence, this time period which you are in and soon to exit. What is this time period? Well, Joyce is keenly aware that for artists especially, they go through this adolescent period and it is a serious crisis, as in monumental crisis. but it is for all adolescents. The great voice of adolescent study is Erik Erikson, and what I've done here for you is just simply copied out of an anthology of readings in educational psychology. The notion of what it means to go through stages of development. For those of you who have spent any time with Joyce, and especially Portrait of the Artist, you can easily identify how these all work. I've sometimes had students that say, you know, it's fascinating, but this kind of intel helps me understand high school in ways I've never really completely comprehended before. How to read this handout. Well, identity diffusion is the first stage as adolescents begin their process. You got to actually read this little handout backwards. So the place that you really want to go is page 53, which is the second page. Down to the bottom, do you see where the numbers are, 1 through 4? And then off to the right there, you probably just want to write 4 stages of adolescent development. That's where we begin. Obviously, in this reading, there's a whole lot that preceded page 52, right? Notice the very first stage is what we call identity diffusion, where the individual has not yet experienced an identity crisis, not that he has made any commitment to a vocation or set of beliefs. There's also no indication that he or she is actively trying to make a commitment. Within identity diffusion, you have a series of moments that are listed for you on the left-hand side of the page, 1 through 4. Intimacy, the diffusion of time perspective, diffusion of industry, and then finally this notion of negative identity. Now, if you want to go through all of that, some of you will say, dude, I totally remember when some of this happened for me as I was entering middle school, and all of a sudden as I was exiting middle school and going into high school. Out of identity diffusion, the idea of diffusion, according to Erikson, as it's listed over here on this other side, the individual fear commitment, involvement, not actually sure what group we're going to be a part of. Do you actually remember showing up to school and believing, now you can laugh about this, but back then you didn't laugh, believing people were going to all look at you when you walked into the building, down the hall, into the lunchroom? If, for example, you changed any part of what you look like, maybe it was your hair, maybe it was a garment, everyone would be looking specifically at you, and you were thoroughly convinced of this. Of course, it never occurred to you to consider that every single other person in the room, of the lunchroom, of the gym, whatever, was the exact same age you are. So all of them also had the exact same view, that everyone was looking at just them, unable to see anyone else. Now you can see the humor of it. Everyone looking, but nobody seeing, because everyone's only looking at themselves, right? You go into the bathroom to check several times a day how you look. Actually, I've been told there are some students at Worland High that actually put mirrors in their locker so that they can see themselves. We did a study a few years ago where some of my AP students sat outside on the hall at lunchtime and watched students walk by the candy shop because there's mirror there, there's glass there. How many students would look at themselves as they walked by? Let's just keep a record in 15 minutes. How many students walk by and kind of notice themselves? Or sit in a bathroom and just kind of watch students walk in, and the first thing they do is they got to find the mirror and see themselves. Or ask students, what's the first thing you do when you walk up to your car? And be honest, and most of them will say, the reflection of myself in the glass. It does happen. Some of you will say, no, I do not. Really? Go ahead. And then when you get in the car, what's the first thing you do? Oh, I'm adjusting my review mirror, which requires of me that I look into it. Fascinating. Fascinating. So that we find ourselves trying to identify ourselves. Erikson said, this is all part of growing up. Who am I? Am I actually this person? And what if I change the way I am, or change the way I look? The second stage is identity foreclosure. In this status, the individual's not experienced a crisis, but nevertheless is committed to his or her goals and beliefs, largely as a result made by others. This is when we start to identify with the group. For those of you that woke up some morning and said, today I'm going to pick a new group to associate with at lunch hour. I will not sit. And so it's a very intentional thing. I'm carrying my little lunch tray, and I'm going to intentionally walk by the very table that I normally sit at. This is all conscious. And look at me walking. I am not walking. I'm walking past them. I'm going to a different group. Today I'm associating with a different group. This is all for Erickson, part of the development. 5-year-olds don't do this. See, 5-year-olds don't do this. And 25-year-olds don't do this. See, 25-year-olds are like, I'll sit where I bloody well want to sit. And I don't really care what anybody says about it, because if you don't want to be with me, that's good news for me, because that's one less person I have to be with. You see how this works? The need to somehow be a part of the group. Oh, good heavens, what if they say something about me, make fun of me? See, all of that can go away. Some of you don't even believe, as I say this, that that actually is going to go away. It will. It will. It does. This is just a phase. This is an identity confusion phase that we have to go through. Who am I? Oh, I know what I am now. I've got some beliefs. Yes, they're my friends' beliefs. Wait a minute. Am I certain? Look at the third stage. Moratorium. And this is the one you want to circle. Because moratorium is the, moratorium is the polite word of, oh, crap. This is when you have your crisis. This is when nothing fits. This is when you've been saying, oh, I am in this group, and all of a sudden one morning it hits you, I've got absolutely nothing in common with these people at all. People maybe I've called my friends for a long time. I don't even like them. If you gave me the option to be with them and I could not be with them, I have to admit this, I would not be with them. I've had seniors that say the greatest thing about graduating is I get to leave these people who I thought were my friends for all these years. And I don't want to say that out loud because I don't want to hurt their feelings, but the reality is, yeah, I got nothing in common with these people. That's moratorium. Crisis. By the way, this happens at home a lot. I am my mother and my father's child. I know exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. All of a sudden, was I found like somewhere? Genetically, I am from this family, really. Because there is absolutely nothing about this family that I can identify with in any way. And their belief systems, their structures of ideas, none of it fits for me. I am out of here. And that's the moratorium part of it. That is to say, gone. Ending, of course, ultimately with this whole thing of identity achievement. See, here's the funny thing. I like to point this out to seniors. Seniors will often make fun of those earlier students they knew who graduated from high school and went away to college and then came back to visit. They went to the football game, the basketball game. High school students are really quick to point out, oh, how funny. Look, they showed up wearing new clothes. Their hat is, for example, worn in a different way. Or they will walk a different way. Or they seem to talk with a different accent. What they're doing, of course, is what you soon will do. Taking on roles and deciding which role is mine. Now, I should point out that in the 21st century, psychologists have been saying for some time that because of any number of forces I'll not go into now, the extent of adolescence is now bumping into years 25, 26, 27. Whereas before it was kind of understood that by the age of 20 or so, a lot of this stuff was decided. A lot of students of this discipline are saying things are different now. And there's adolescence that goes now into 26, even 27 and beyond. In other words, the notion of identity achievement seems to happen later and later for American students for reasons, again, that I'll not get into. By the way, I said American. We're seeing this as well in Japan, especially in South Korea. It's a function of not getting into the workforce as quickly, right? So, for example, a lot of us will go 4 years to college, but then we'll turn right around and go 2 or 3 or 4 more years to college before we actually identify ourselves with a real job. We can see ourselves into our mid-20s, late 20s before we have a real career track. And so because that's the case, we're not exactly sure who we are yet. Who will I be? What will I do? Now to Joyce. Stephen Daedalus is an artist. So he goes through his moratorium, his crisis, in this novel. And in the process, he has to come to terms with the fact that there are certain things he has thought he believed all his life, he no longer believes. So, for example, he finally decides, no, I don't believe in this whole religion thing. His mother is completely devastated. She is on her deathbed. She will just beg him, please just tell me you believe. Please, 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 just tell me you believe. Stephen will report to his pal, I said no. His pal's like, what? And Stephen said, yeah, and then she died. the last thing she hears from Stephen is, no, I can't believe in it. I will never believe in it. And his pal is like, what is wrong with you? Dude, do you not love your mother? He said, I love her deeply. Well, then what's going on? You could have just lied. I'm a poet. I will never lie. An artist never lies. That's what makes him an artist. I got to tell the truth. And if the truth is I can't believe it, I ain't lying. I will never lie again in my life. I'm an artist. Whoa! Now see, for a good number of us, we have the tendency to kind of look at this and go, yeah, what is wrong with somebody like this? Joyce will say, that's the difference between normal people and an artist. Artists are not made. They're born. And they see the world totally differently. And because of that, they're outcasts. Because the rest of the world can't get it and can't understand them. And so artists will go through this process of trying to assimilate into a world that cannot understand them. A world they themselves cannot understand. And in the process, of course, tremendous identity confusion along the way. Now, how is Joyce going to tell a story like this? Well, let's get to technique now for Joyce. Joyce was very influenced by Freud. It was Sigmund Freud who had said in any number of places, 1901, of course, he publishes his classic work, Interpret Dreams. Right? Freud had argued that there's this thing called the conscience, this notion of a consciousness. And this is kind of like the ongoing inner dialogue. But that's only about 5% of your actual thoughts. And while, for example, we're sitting here talking, that in fact there's this whole other thing that Freud never called subconscious, later it would be called this. He called it the unconscious. The stuff that goes on in your mind, it's going on there right now, and you're completely unaware of it. No, I am not thinking that. Freud says, well, of course you're going to see that. You're unaware of it. Well, how do you know that I'm thinking that? It's called dreams. Our dreams tell us that there's all kinds of interesting stuff psychologically happening within our world, psychic world, that we just do not know about. Now, this idea was very influential on a number of artists. Joyce is one of those stream of consciousness writers. Now, what does that mean? Well, stream of consciousness is the idea that you're going to report in writing exactly what's going on in the mind of the person in the story. The thoughts. That's all. You're just going to report the thoughts. So, for example, Freud had said it this way. If we could somehow hit the print key of all of the thoughts that you've had since I started this lecture, and I said a lot of words, and you were sitting there, with the exception of a brief whispering to somebody or whatever, you were not talking throughout this entire 40 minutes lecture. And yet Freud said if we hit the print key and printed all of the thoughts that you had, he said, first of all, there would be so much paper it'd fit in this room. Floor to ceiling, the entire room. I'm talking about for just one. And then we'd have to open the door. And then all those thoughts would spill out into the hallway. And the paper would continue to build all the way down towards it'd fill our school for a 40-minute. That's what Freud said. He said our minds are working all the time, simultaneously on millions of different levels. We're always thinking. It's going on. I'm unaware of most of it. Right, that's the point. You're unaware of it. Joyce wants to play a game. He asks it this way. What if I told a story about a single person for a single day, and all I did was to report what that person thought? So, for example, he gets up in the morning, talks to his wife, takes a little walk down to the butcher shop where they have to go to get their meat. He walks into the butcher shop. While he's in the butcher shop, he talks to the butcher, but then this young girl walks in. He looks at her for a while. She leaves. What if Joyce says, all I did was just simply write their thoughts down, as I kind of imagined they would be thinking? What would that look like? The answer is this. It's called Ulysses. And in 1922, he publishes this thing. This novel is so controversial, believe it or not, that an American court, a judge, says that if you bring this novel with you into the New York harbor, you will be put in jail. This book is immediately banned in the United States. Yeah. Again, this is the #1 book of the 20th century, a book that I should point out very few people have ever actually read. But there's a reason for that. Joyce